G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'm sure you've heard that Australia has a problem with our coal-based export industry and our coal-based electricity grid and our coal-loving Liberal National Party government and our coal-loving Labor unionist workers. And a big hypothetical, theoretical, wouldn't it be nice if solution to all of those problems is what they call carbon capture and storage. So the idea is that they're allowed, entitled and permitted to continue to shit in the sky, pumping out carbon dioxide as fast as they can dig the carbon up from the ground and burn it in a furnace somewhere. And then the promise is that some nebulous, amorphous, yet to be settled on future technology will then suck the carbon back out of the sky so they can basically continue on with busyness as usual right now, making more profits for higher dividends and fatter wage packets. Well, fortuitously, serendipitously, by coincidence, by the synchronicity, ABC Radio National's, I think it's the Big Ideas program, they're going to give us a little bit of a documentary on carbon capture and storage, smoke and mirrors, and all sorts of other bullshit. So settle back and we'll see what there is to see in the real world.
Of the United Nations called the prospect Code Red for Humanity, after a major report declared that climate change could make parts of the planet uninhabitable. After more than a decade of energy policy paralysis, the federal government has unveiled its plan to guide billions of taxpayer dollars into new low emissions technologies.
Technology changes everything. Our approach is technology, not taxes.
Some of the government's investment has been in carbon capture and storage. Climate scientists say that is an expensive technology which has so far badly failed to perform as planned.
The Morrison Liberal government believes the key way to lower our CO2 emissions and tackle climate change is through technology. And one of the technologies it's backing is carbon capture and storage, or CCS. Hello, I'm Annabelle Quince, and in this rear vision, the story of CCS.
Carbon capture and storage has really two parts: carbon capture, carbon storage. My name is Julio Friedman. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. The carbon capture part is basically a chemical or a physical process that separates CO2 out from a mix of gases, say from a smokestack or from a steel mill. You have to get the CO2 to high concentration, typically 95% pure. The second part is carbon storage. You then take that carbon dioxide and inject it deep in the subsurface. Minimum 1 kilometer depth, typically more like 1.5 or 2 kilometers depth, in order to keep it out of the atmosphere. That's really it.
There are two broad ways that we think we're going to be able to take carbon out of the Earth's atmosphere. My name is Dr. James Dyke, and I'm an Earth system scientist based at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. The first way is that we'll be able to sort of intercept some of the emissions that we produce through burning fossil fuels. So, for example, we would put scrubbers on the chimneys of coal-fired power stations, and what that would do is, as the hot exhaust gases move over these sort of chemical membranes, it would capture the carbon dioxide, maybe in a liquid form or some kind of solid matrix. Then once the carbon dioxide is captured, it would be compressed and then stored underground, probably in a depleted oil and gas field, where it would have to stay for many thousands of years before it turns into a kind of an inert mineral form. The other approach would have us take carbon directly from the atmosphere, and there's two ways in which we might do that, kind of a low-tech and a high-tech way. The low-tech way is basically you plant trees, because as trees grow, they absorb carbon dioxide and they lock that up in the tissues, in their bark, in their roots, in their leaves. And the other is a much more high-tech way. Sometimes it's called direct air capture, and you can imagine these kind of vast machines that look a little bit like air conditioners, and they would pass the air with carbon dioxide into it over these kind of chemical membranes or catalysts, and they would store carbon in that way, and then they would pump it down underground.
The process of extracting CO2 is one that began in the 1930s.
The first commercial process was designed in 1930. The first commercial unit was built in 1938. It's where we get CO2 for things like soda pop and dry ice and all kinds of things that we do. And the first CO2 injection began for enhanced oil recovery in 1972. The first climate-based project began in 1996. And for the past 50 years, we've been separating carbon dioxide and injecting it underground with no incident. So it's quite established and safe in many ways.
When people talk about carbon capture and storage, or sometimes it's sequestration, CCS, it's actually CCUS. It's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Carbon capture and utilization goes back to the 1970s, and it was first developed in the United States as a mechanism or way of getting more oil and sometimes gas out of previously depleted wells. This can come in two ways. The first way is you could maybe take off some of the carbon dioxide as you're burning coal. But another way is that you can extract some of the carbon dioxide that gets released when you try to extract natural gas or fossil gas. So fossil gas is often mainly methane, but when you pump that methane up, it often comes with a significant amount of carbon dioxide as well. Now, previously, that carbon dioxide would have just been released into the atmosphere. And since the 1970s, scientists, engineers have worked out a way of capturing that carbon dioxide, and then you can use it. And there's two main ways that you can use it. The first one is you can actually sell it to the drinks industry, because they always need carbon dioxide for their carbonated drinks products. Or you could use it to drive it back down into existing oil wells to force small amounts of oil nearer to the large pipes, which are basically sucking up out of the ground. It's still the case that most carbon dioxide that it is captured, whichever route you're taking it, is used in this utilization way. It's used for enhanced oil or gas recovery.
How is CO2 used to enhance oil and gas recovery? And does this process lead to less or more carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere?
With an oil field, usually the oil comes out under its natural pressure and comes to the surface and then is processed and so on like that. But after a while, the pressure goes down and oil is not coming out as fast. Greg Bourne, councillor with the Climate Council. My background was with BP for many, many years, exploring for, drilling for oil, gas, and things like that. If you can push the oil out by pumping something underground, you can enhance the oil recovery. And so carbon dioxide has been used to do that. So it sweeps the oil ahead of it. Eventually the oil comes back up to the surface. Some of the carbon dioxide comes back up to the surface as well, and then gets recycled back down. But it has to be remembered that with the enhanced oil recovery, I think something like 45 million tons of carbon dioxide has been put underground by around about 25 projects around the world. But in enhancing the oil recovery, when that oil has been burnt, something like 73 million tons has been put into the atmosphere. And so it's actually been net positive, not net negative.
Overall, carbon capture and storage, when used to enhance oil and gas recovery, actually releases more CO2 into the atmosphere than it stores. So when did CCS start to be thought of as a technology that could be used to mitigate climate change and decrease CO2?
Probably see the emergence of carbon capture and storage from around the 1990s, and that was often associated with this term clean coal. The idea then was that we could continue to burn coal in thermal power stations, but we would reduce the climate impacts of burning this coal because we would capture the carbon dioxide that's being emitted from the burning of the coal. Now, that never took on, and it's still the case that there aren't any real commercial applications of carbon capture and storage when it comes to coal-fired electricity plants. And the reason for that is because it makes burning coal more expensive. If you think about installing those scrubbers on the chimneys, you think about all the infrastructure that you need to transport, either shipping or piping the concentrated carbon, and then the engineering work that's required to develop the sequestration sites, which is probably the biggest part of the problem. You know, how can you safely store vast amounts, and we're talking about billions of tons of carbon dioxide that we need to do this at that kind of scale. All of that's tremendously expensive, and when you put all that on top of the costs of burning coal, you completely remove the point of burning coal, which is it's cheap. It generates an awful lot of energy in terms of bang for buck. So it's never really caught on.
Well, let's be clear, carbon capture and storage is already working. We've got it working in Australia. We've got the biggest project in the world in Australia. Mostly...
Can I just step in there, Minister? Because as I understand it, there is not a single large-scale CCS site for coal operating in this country. There has been one for gas, which took a long time to get up. Australia spent $1.3 billion of taxpayers' money into this research since 2003. Am I wrong? Is there a large-scale CCS site, carbon capture and storage site for coal?
Yes, there is in the US, but look, let's
not
be
here, even though we spent all that money.
Not here. No, because the focus for CCS, the biggest opportunity for CCS is decarbonising industry, and this is my point.
Advocates of CCS technology, like the Federal Energy Minister Angus Taylor, argue that its value is in decarbonising industry, and that since the late 1990s, CCS has been doing that successfully.
We now have about 22 large-scale projects worldwide, and all of these projects are bigger than, say, 500,000 tons a year, so they're quite large. The biggest is about 4 million tons a year. That is, in fact, in Gorgon project in Australia. They are all over the world, ranging from Japan to Australia to China. The Middle East has several projects, a few projects in Europe, and about 10 projects, 11 in North America, a project in Brazil, and all of these are substantive. These aren't pilot projects. There have been over 100 test projects and pilot projects and stuff. The 22 that I've been talking about are all commercial projects.
And what are they connected to? Are they connected to some kind of plant that's actually producing a whole lot of CO2?
So most of these projects are actually associated with industrial facilities. So in the United States, for example, we have a project with an ethanol plant that captures about 1 million tons a year of CO2 from biofuels refining. One of the first projects was actually from natural gas processing facilities, the Sleipner project in Norway. There is a steel mill in Abu Dhabi that captures carbon dioxide before it goes into the process and separates that, stores it. There's a couple of coal-fired power plants, one in Canada and one in the US, that also capture, but the other 20 projects are from industrial facilities.
The process has been around for almost 50 years, since the 70s, and since that time, globally, we've captured about 260 million tonnes that's been captured and stored, and at the moment, it's around 40 million tonnes per annum that's being captured and stored globally. Andrew McConville, I'm the Chief Executive of APIA, and APIA is the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, and we represent about 92% of all Australia's oil and gas production. And there's actually about 59 carbon capture and storage facilities that are either operating or are in construction. And here in Australia, we have the world's largest carbon capture and storage facility on Barrow Island. That's a project operated by Chevron. And we also have the potential for some very large other projects across the country.
The world's biggest project dedicated to carbon capture and storage is the Gorgon gas plant in Western Australia. It's owned and operated by Chevron, with Shell and ExxonMobil also owning about a quarter. But when the Gorgon gas plant got the go-ahead, the environmental approval set a target for the first 5 years of capturing and storing 80% of CO2 emissions. And that 5-year deadline ended on the 18th of July, 2021. Peter Milne is a former oil and gas engineer. The 5-year deadline was last week. How close did the Gorgon gas project get to that 80% target?
Well, the short answer is not very close at all. My estimate is that they only injected about 30% of the CO2 they should have done. It's a very big shortfall, no doubt about that.
My understanding is they were able to capture as much carbon as they wanted, but they were not able to store it. But the challenge was that the reservoir began to behave in a way that they didn't quite anticipate. Specifically, the sands began to close up. Whenever you work in the subsurface, there's room to be surprised. But in this case, the surprise was that the injection limits for one well were smaller than they had initially expected.
I think what we've started to learn through the Chevron project on Barrow Island is a little bit more about the geology. Some of that's been a little bit more challenging than was perhaps first estimated. But what we are seeing now is those challenges are being overcome as we start to work through issues like balancing pressure and so on. And the project is getting much closer to its nameplate capacity. And over the life of the project, we expect it to be able to store considerable amounts of carbon, as I say, that's sort of 4 million tonnes a year. But you're right, and it hasn't been without its challenges, but I think it's been very important that we've learnt as we've gone, and it's been as much about balancing the geology. It's not about the technology per se. The technology is well understood, but every reservoir into which carbon is stored has different characteristics. So it's about being able to adapt and understand that and make it work effectively. But the process is well understood, the geology is well understood, and it's about mixing those two together to get the right outcome.
The total greenhouse gas emissions saved by all of Australia's solar panels in 1 year could be wiped out because of technical problems at the Gorgon gas plant in the state's northwest. And that's just part of a broader problem facing the country as it tries to meet its Paris Agreement target.
On paper, you can draw how, yes, we're going to capture it this way, we are going to compress it this way, and we're going to pump it underground here. But then you actually look at the machinery involved. The machinery to strip out the carbon dioxide from the gas stream that is there is complex machinery, highly complex. You then have to compress it. The compressing is really quite significant, and then it has to be piped. So these technologies are not easy technologies by any means. They are big chemical engineering works and not something that offers itself to replication all around the world. And there are real problems there for Chevron.
You're listening to Rear Vision with me, Annabelle Quince. And today we're looking at one of the technologies the federal government is hoping will decrease Australia's carbon emissions: carbon capture and storage. It's estimated that over the past 25 years, CCS projects have captured somewhere between 260 and 300 million tonnes of CO2. So where has most of that CO2 gone?
What you need to understand or explore how much of that sequestered carbon is actually being put underground forever and how much is still for enhanced oil recovery. And so, for example, some plants will say that they've captured maybe 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, but that doesn't translate to sequestering 100,000 tonnes. What they will do is they might sell it or attempt to sell it to the drinks industry. They may also have relationships with existing oil and gas infrastructure so they can either pipe or transport it for enhanced oil recovery. And then almost what's left, either the stuff they can't really sell or use, then they will sequester. When you look at the amounts of carbon that's being sequestered that way, we're probably talking less than hundreds of thousands of tonnes. And we need to put that in the context of every year we emit about 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
In terms of where the CO2 goes, about 70 or 75% of the tons go into existing oil fields, for the most part for a process called enhanced oil recovery. About 25% just go into what we call saline formations, intensely brine-bearing units, again, very deep in the earth. Those are strictly for the purpose of storage. And they capture 40 million tons a year of carbon dioxide and store it underground. And in total, we've put more than 300 million tons of carbon dioxide underground strictly for climate purposes. And really, that's been going on now for about 25 years.
Let's just get our heads around those figures. Over the past 25 years, CCS projects have captured around 300 million tonnes of CO2. And today, it captures about 40 million tonnes a year. So how does that compare to the amount of CO2 being put into the atmosphere?
We put 36 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year from the energy system. So it really is a drop in the ocean. And the amount that's gone underground is minuscule compared with the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere from the oil, gas, and coal that's produced.
That's 36 billion tonnes of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere each year, with CCS capturing 40 million tonnes. And if my maths is right, that's a bit over 1% of the CO2 annually. But what if we could capture more than that? Would there be room underground to store it? And could we do that safely?
Our best scientific understanding is that conventional storage units like the ones that I've described can hold between 10 and 20 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. There's way, way more rock in the subsurface than there is hydrocarbons, and we know that we can store enormous volumes of CO2. Just the Gulf of Mexico has well over 1 trillion tons of capacity. So we're not going to run out of rock anytime soon. That's good because we clearly continue to need to reduce our emissions, and this is one of the things you can do.
In terms of storage, I think it's been established that there's sufficient space. The question then is, can we do it safely? And what would need to happen is that we would need to put it in a site where we know it's not going to come out. Because you can imagine the worst case scenario is that we would store billions and billions of tons of carbon dioxide. And then at some point later this century, or maybe even beyond this century, there could be some kind of geological event, maybe an earthquake, maybe a volcano, that would rupture or fracture these geological sequestration sites that would release significant amounts of carbon dioxide in very, very short timescales. And when you're looking at that, the worst case scenario is that we would begin to replicate some of the previous extreme volcanism that we can see in the Earth's geological record that have preceded mass extinction events. These kind of terrifying prospects of us releasing this huge pulse of carbon. And the way we make it safe is through a process of mineralization where the concentrated carbon dioxide gas basically reacts with the rocks around it and it forms carbonate rocks. And so the hope is that if you select the right kind of geological sequestration site, you'll be able to accelerate the process whereby the carbon dioxide gas gets made into a mineral. But I think it's fair to say that we've got no real idea how we're going to be able to scale that up. I think the assumption right now is we'll figure it out when we need to.
Gas has been stored underground for thousands and even millions of years, and this is a process that is very, very similar to that. And you know, our industry, the oil and gas industry, has absolute expertise in being able to capture and to store carbon in the same way that we do with gas. I mean, at the moment, we store gas in underground geological reservoirs as well, i.e. we extract the gas and then we put it back in to when we need it, when there's peaks in demand. So it's a process that's very well understood and very well known. If you look at the projects that kicked off in the US in the 70s, they are monitored continuously and there have been no issues with the safety. And there's a body of research that shows that it is able to be done safely. We're very practiced at being able to store and move gas, and I think that people can have very great confidence that we've been able to do this safely and effectively for 45 years, and we would expect that to absolutely continue.
What regulators have now done in a number of states, and particularly in Australia, is basically said, if you're putting anything underground, you are going to have to monitor pretty much in perpetuity the pressure underground. You're having to listen for micro fractures, mini earthquakes, what is actually happening. Because if you are literally going to put a lot of CO2 underground, you are going to have to monitor it. Most companies that we know, do not last in perpetuity. They last for a number of years and then they eventually shut down. Who then picks up the tab for what is being stored underground? So there's a definite social risk and indeed environmental risk of storing CO2 underground.
But what about the cost? Over the past 25 years, as the cost of renewable technologies have dramatically decreased, CCS technology has not.
It is certainly not too expensive a technology. It is hard to finance, which is quite a different thing. So by example, let's take offshore wind in the North Sea. For many years, it was extremely expensive. We created policies to finance the projects and we ratcheted down the cost. And part of the challenge is that a carbon capture project, especially a retrofit, looks like additional cost on an existing facility. But in fact, what you're really trying to compare with these things is how much abatement do you get. The thing that's fundamentally changed in the past 3 years is we have accepted we all have to go to net zero. Net zero is the landscape, and to get to net zero, you have to reduce emissions. So it's important to now start comparing things on the cost of abatement. In some places, for example, in Western Australia, you have terrific solar and wind resources. There, the cost of renewable generation is very low, but the potential to displace fossil energy is also low because it's not tied into markets where it can do that. You're creating ammonia and hydrogen for sale into Japan. That's wonderful. We absolutely need green hydrogen and we need green ammonia. But the cost of abatement associated with that is many hundreds of dollars per ton. So it's more helpful to think about these things as where does carbon capture make sense in terms of a roadmap to get to zero. And in many parts of Australia, I am 100% convinced that carbon capture will not be the cheapest method. There will be other ways you can do it. But for some sectors, for some facilities, carbon capture will simply be the cheapest pathway to zero.
There's been an exponential decrease in the costs of solar panels, for example, and that's largely as a consequence of economies of scale and as developing new technology and new ways of manufacturing them at scale. So now I think it's pretty much robustly established that generating electricity from photovoltaics is the cheapest form of electricity that we've ever been able to do. It's much, much cheaper than any fossil fuel, and that includes cheap coal. The problem that we've got with carbon capture, or the promises of clean coal, or however you want to describe it, is that these are essentially all efforts to maintain existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So 80% of energy worldwide is still supplied by coal, oil and gas. And there is tremendous economic incentives and also, I would argue, political incentives for the maintenance of fossil fuel infrastructure. Obviously, when that collides with a climate crisis, you have to come up with solutions. And the obvious solution is you stop burning coal, oil and gas. But the promise of future carbon removals, either through direct air capture or planting trees or clean coal or whatever one of the many zoo of these kind of different technologies are, I would argue they're essentially motivated to maintain existing fossil fuel infrastructure.
What we're seeing is the cost of the technology is coming down over time as we start to identify more storage that's available in order to capture that carbon. I think it's also the case that as we start to consider the cost of carbon capture and storage against the full cost, for example, of generating electricity through a system, it does actually start to match up on a cost competitive basis. And as more facilities come on stream and as we continue to see greater scale of operations, that cost will come down. I think the most expensive thing is not to do anything at all. And so what we're really trying to do is say, okay, how can we continue to operate this technology at scale and see those costs per unit come down? And you're right in one sense that it has been a costly exercise to get to where we are. But I think as we look into the longer term and as we start to see the importance of carbon capture and storage as part of the overall emissions reduction equation, while we want to continue to still be able to have all of the things that we take for granted, whether it be access to fuel, large-scale industrial processes, steel manufacturing, fertiliser production, all of these things that rely very heavily on generating carbon, I think we'll find that the cost competitiveness of these solutions is one that makes it very compelling.
Basically, an oil company or a gas company, if they did not have to put the CO2 underground, they would not. So the only way, logically, that these projects would take off would be if there was a price on carbon. And we know within Australia, carbon pricing has been a rather toxic debate politically. But the IEA, for example, would expect that the imputed price of carbon would go from around about $30 or $40 a tonne, which it is trading at on a worldwide basis in Europe, for example, that it would go up to a couple of $100 a tonne. That would then give a powerful incentive for companies to do something, either reduce their emissions, find a carbon capture and storage possibility, or shut up shop. Those are the sort of the three options. It is going to be very expensive, and it's very, very, very hard to replicate. Every single place is different. There's no one model which works, and then you can roll it out first 1,000 times and then 10,000 times. It doesn't work that way. Good example, something which is replicable, is a solar panel. The first ones built in the 1970s. First was 1, then it was 1,000. Now there are literally billions of almost identical solar panels in the world. That is not the way of carbon capture and storage. Every single one is different. Every capture is different. Every compression is different. And every single reservoir is different. So it is not conducive to the scale economies that you get with solar panels or wind farms or batteries. But the biggest danger, I repeat again, is that too often it allows people to overpromise and then underdeliver. And we need to stay below 1.5. And to do that requires immediate action, not action put off in the land of hope and dreams.
Greg Bourne, Councillor with the Climate Council. Now the guests, Andrew McConville, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Petroleum Producers and Exploration Association. Julio Friedman, Senior Research Scholar at the Centre on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And James Dyke, an Earth System Scientist at the University of Exeter. The sound engineer is Russell Stapleton. I'm Annabelle Quince, and this is Rear Vision on Radio National.
There you go. Rear Vision, not big ideas. So there you go. And now you know. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has explained that humanity must, no excuses, no denials, no rationalisations will be accepted, must reduce fossil carbon emissions to the atmosphere by 50% by 2030. Because that'll be the easy 50%. We then have to reduce to zero, which is the other 50% that we are currently emitting by 2050. Otherwise, according to the people who've spent their lives actually studying this, rather than reading science denialist posts on social media, the advice from the people who know what they're talking about is that if we don't reduce to zero carbon emissions from human global industrial sources by 2050, then it's pretty much game over for human civilization, because we won't be able to feed the cities, because we won't be able to grow anything, because the weather makes agriculture increasingly unprofitable and nobody can afford to plant the seed that the banker doesn't think is ever going to grow high enough to be harvested. Essentially kind of thing. Actually, it's probably a pretty bad time for agriculture, generally speaking, because to my sure and certain knowledge, nowhere on the planet does there exist a solar-powered electric tractor or a plough or a harvester. And to make a solar panel, you have to grow silicon crystals, and you do that with really, really mega-sized gas ovens with which to generate the temperature at which the silicon is a liquid in which the crystals can grow. After you've done growing the crystals, then you thinly slice them and connect them with wires. And battery boxes these days are all made of plastic. And plastic is nothing more or less than chemically solidified crude oil. So you've got to have a petrochemical industry in order to manufacture plastic, as well as synthetic rubber. And electric cars have got synthetic rubber tyres. So, you alls, welcome to the high technology existential threat. Nobody knows how to live anymore without burning coal and oil and gas and manufacturing plastic and iron and steel and aluminium and concrete. We no longer have the ecology necessary to live a pre-industrial lifestyle, and we have to stop shitting in the sky. And anybody who wants to pay attention to the smoke and mirrors brigade from the Carbon Capture and Storage Propaganda Committee, once again, as I said on a different video made earlier today, I sentence you to kick yourself up the arse until your nose bleeds, or your kneecaps fail from heel kicking yourself at every step. This is not something that you can rationalise or denial or bullshit. You've been bullshitting about it for 45 years that I've been paying attention. Carbon capture and storage is not an answer. What would have been a really good idea would have been to put a great big tax on anything that emits fossil carbon. Put a smaller tax on anything that emits renewable carbon. But we didn't do that. John Howard was committed to a carbon tax back in 1995, 96, when he got shit canned, when he left office. No, got that wrong. That was when he came into office. But when he left, John Howard was thinking that we were going to have a carbon tax. He was committed to it. And Tony Abbott replaced him as leader of the Liberal Party, and Tony Abbott decided that he could harmonise the rednecks, I guess, synchronise the bogans around the idea of resisting any increase in the price of petrol and electricity and diesel. Therefore, thus and because the conservative side of politics has been in the ascendancy in Australia ever since. God knows why they want to call themselves conservative, because they have never conserved anything in 12,300 fucking years since the broadacre death cult of harvest everythingism first appeared at Göbekli Tepe in what is now southeastern Turkey, where the first hybrid grain went into the midden 30 years after the midden started to grow. 300 years later, every grain in the midden was a hybrid strain, a crossbreed from plants 250 kilometres that way and 500 kilometres that way. 400 years after that, the city was deserted. It was surrounded by a ring of desert, and the people who lived on the edges had covered the fucking place over in sand. Tried to bury the idea of harvest everythingism. And this is the first time that they've ever successfully crashed every ecology in the whole fucking biosphere all around the world together. It's really quite impressive. Really fucking irritating and annoying and kind of depressing looking back on it. When you look forward, when you extrapolate, when you prognosticate, when you see where all the trends are going, the bats are winning, and it's not a fucking surprise why. It's no kind of surprise why, especially when you listen to the sort of thing that just laid out, clearly documented it. And I love the way they alternated between the planet-killing fucking sui genocidal pricks who are quite happy to hold their little hand out and get paid to eat their grandchildren's lunch and trash the fucking planet forever, versus the people who've made their career out of trying to figure out what's actually happening. It's a constant surprise to me that any of the wildlife talks to me, because if I was them, fuck, I wouldn't talk to people. Truly, not when you look at what the people have done to the world. So they've got a better opinion of us than I do, I guess. Such is life, said Ned Kelly before they hung him. Such is life, said Joseph Furphy, writing as Tom Collins. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. See? They still talk to me, despite the fact that I'm a human being. Ciao.